Dolly Parton stopped singing mid-verse. Not at the end of a line, not at a breath. Mid-word. Her voice simply stopped, and her hand went up slowly to her mouth. Jimmy Fallon stood behind his desk and went completely still. 300 people in that studio had come to watch a legend perform, and instead they were watching something no one had ever seen. Dolly Parton, unable to continue. The Tonight Show had been on the air for 70 years. Something like this had never happened. Not like this. It was a Thursday night in March 2024. The Tonight Show was recording what was expected to be a landmark season finale, and Dolly Parton had agreed to close the show with a live performance, something she had rarely done on late-night television in years. The audience that night was a specific kind of crowd, mostly women between 55 and 70, many of whom had driven in from neighboring states. Some had waited in line since 6 in the morning. They didn't come because they'd seen a ticket giveaway on social media. They came because it was Dolly, and they loved her the way people love something that shaped them before they knew they were being shaped. She walked onto the stage in a sequined ivory jacket, laughing before she even reached the microphone. The interview had gone perfectly. Stories from the Smoky Mountains, a joke about her wigs that made Jimmy Fallon lose composure for a full 15 seconds. A moment where she leaned across the desk and patted his hand like a grandmother settling a restless child. Everything was warm. Everything was flowing. The Tonight Show's segment producer later said she had worked in television for 26 years, and nothing in the final hour had seemed even slightly unusual. The control room still talks about what happened next. The band began the opening notes of the song. Dolly stepped back from her chair toward the microphone stand at the edge of the stage, took a breath, and opened her mouth. The first line came out clean and warm and exactly the way she sang it every time. And then a woman in the third row held something up. Not a phone, not a sign, just a photograph. Small, old edges soft from handling. Not framed, not laminated, just a Polaroid-sized square, slightly yellowed, the kind of thing you would find folded inside an old Bible. The woman held it up gently, the way you hold something that could come apart if you pressed too hard. Dolly saw it from the stage. Her eyes moved to it the way eyes move when something registers before the mind catches up. Not recognition, exactly, but something earlier than recognition, something from before language. Her mouth stayed open. The next lyric didn't come. Her left hand, the one holding the microphone, moved down slowly to her side. Her right hand went to her chest, fingers spread flat. Her face changed in a way that wasn't grief and wasn't joy, but was something underneath both of those things, something that only surfaces when a person sees something they had convinced themselves they might never see again. Jimmy Fallon leaned forward from behind his desk. Dolly? 2 words. Low, careful, the way you say someone's name when you aren't sure they're still with you. The entire studio froze. No one had seen her stop before. Not mid-song, not mid-verse. The questions moved through the room in silence. Was she unwell? Had something gone wrong with the stage monitor? She was 78 years old. Was she okay? The band had trailed off one by one, each musician watching her, until only the bassist was holding a single quiet note, and then he stopped too. Dolly stood at the edge of the stage and stared at the photograph in the woman's hands. She did not look away. She did not blink. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by her microphone. Maggie, just the name, nothing else. 300 people held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1967. Dolly Parton wasn't always Dolly Parton. Legend an icon. In March of 1967, a 21-year-old Dolly Parton stood in a narrow corridor behind the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville. Not the main stage. A secondary showcase room on the building's lower floor, maybe 200 seats, built for warm-up acts and second-tier bookings. She remembers it was raining. She remembers the heat of the single-stage spotlight had been the warmest thing in the room all night. She had been in Nashville for 3 years. She had a record deal that felt like it could dissolve if she breathed wrong. She had performed that night for an audience of 31 people, she counted, and 11 of them had left before she finished her second song. She stood in that corridor afterward, holding her guitar by the neck, and she was crying. Not loudly, the quiet kind of crying you do when you are trying very hard to keep yourself together and not quite managing it. That was when Maggie Calloway found her. Maggie was 18 years old, a music student at a small college in Knoxville, who had taken a Greyhound bus to Nashville for the weekend because she had heard a girl on the radio 6 months earlier and had not been able to stop thinking about the voice. She didn't have a ticket to the main show. She had asked around backstage until someone pointed her toward the lower room, and then she had followed the sound of boot heels on a concrete floor. She came alone because none of her friends understood why she loved that voice so much. Maggie found Dolly in the corridor and didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood there. Then she said, "You were singing like there were 10,000 people in that room." I counted 31. "But you sang like it was 10,000. Dolly laughed first, and then cried harder, and that made both of them laugh. They stood in that corridor for 2 hours. Maggie talked about her music theory classes and a piece she was writing that kept resolving to the wrong chord. Dolly talked about the mountains she grew up in and a melody she had in her head that didn't have a shape yet. A stagehand walked past with a cart of equipment, and Maggie stopped him and asked if he had a camera. He had a small instant camera in his jacket pocket, the kind that was common backstage in those years, and she asked him to take one photograph. He took one shot. That was the photograph. The two of them standing beside the back wall of the Ryman in 1967, Dolly still in her stage costume, Maggie in a college jacket with a tear in the left elbow, both of them squinting slightly in the flash. Before Maggie left that night, Dolly reached into her jacket and pulled out a pen and wrote something on the back of the photograph. Not a lyric, just a sentence. For Maggie, you were my 10,000. March 1967. Maggie kept the photograph inside a Bible on her bookshelf. She never showed it to anyone. Not to her husband, not to her daughters, not to any of the hundreds of students she taught over the course of her career. It was hers. She said she didn't want to become a story. She wanted to stay a memory. She became a school teacher in Sevierville, Tennessee, the same county Dolly grew up in. She taught music for 34 years. She attended every Dolly Parton concert she could reach by car. She raised 2 daughters and had 6 grandchildren and built a life that was full in the quiet way that most good lives are. She never reached out to Dolly. She never tried to close the distance that fame creates. In November 2023, Maggie Calloway was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Doctors gave her 4 to 6 months. She told her family there was one thing she wanted to do before she was too ill to travel. Her daughter found the photograph inside the Bible and wrote 3 pages to Dolly's management team that same evening. Dolly called back within 24 hours. The arrangement was made in secret. The Tonight Show staff were told only that a specific guest would be seated in the 3rd row and that the row was not to be disturbed before the show ended. They were not told who she was. They were not told about the photograph. Dolly had said to her team, very simply, "I want her to feel like a person. not a moment. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Dolly Parton had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. She had told no one on the production staff what was in the third row. She had carried her own copy of the photograph in the inside pocket of her ivory jacket since that morning. Maggie knew only that she had a seat in the third row. She did not know that Dolly had already found her face on the side stage monitor the moment the studio doors opened. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Dolly was mid-song when she saw Maggie hold the photograph up from the third row. She recognized it in less than a second. Not the image, but the shape of it. The worn edges. The way Maggie held it with both hands. The way you hold something that has waited a long time to be seen. 57 years of silence, standing up in a third-row seat on shaking legs, holding a Polaroid toward the stage lights. Dolly already had the same photograph in her jacket pocket. She had carried her own copy the entire day. She stepped down from the stage, not to the side stairs. She walked directly off the front edge, a drop of about 3 feet, and a stagehand moved to catch her, and she waved him off without looking. Jimmy Fallon came around his desk slowly. He looked at the audience, then at Dolly, then at the third row. He did not try to narrate it. He said quietly, "Folks, I think we need to let this happen." Dolly moved through the center aisle. She wasn't rushing. The people seated on either side stepped back to give her room the way a crowd parts not from instruction but from instinct, the way people make space when something real is moving through. She reached the third row. Maggie was standing. She was thin. She was wearing a blue dress. She was 74 years old, and she had come from Sevierville by car on a Tuesday, and she was holding the photograph the way she had held it for 57 years, with both hands, carefully, the back of it turned away from the room. Dolly reached out and put both hands around Maggie's hands without taking the photograph from her. She didn't pull it away. She just held it with her. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You kept it." Maggie's hands were shaking. "Every day." "I carried mine tonight." Dolly reached into the inside pocket of her ivory jacket and drew out a folded piece of paper, her copy of the same photograph, older, the edges softened from handling, folded once, and carried for longer than anyone in that room knew. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that has been folded for 40 years, with 2 hands and very slowly. "For Maggie, you were my 10,000. March 1967. Maggie looked at it for a long moment. Her voice broke once and then steadied itself. "I never told anyone," she said. "Neither did I." A pause. Then Maggie said, very softly, "I didn't want pity. I just wanted to hear you sing one more time." Dolly's tears were running, but her face was completely still. She said, almost to herself, "You were the reason I went back." She held Maggie's face in both hands, the way you hold something precious and breakable. Then she stepped back, and she started singing. Not into the microphone, not for the cameras. Directly to Maggie, from 3 feet away in the middle of the third row aisle, with no band and no amplification, and nothing between them but 57 years. The audience didn't move for 4 full seconds. Then a woman somewhere near the back of the studio stood up. Then 3 more people in the middle section. Then it moved outward like a wave from a center point. 300 people on their feet, and the sound in that room was not quite applause, but something larger and less organized than applause. Questlove stood up from behind his drum kit. He did not sit back down. The director did not cut to commercial. The cameraman closest to the third row kept his lens on Dolly and Maggie and did not move it. Jimmy Fallon stood at the edge of the stage, with one hand pressed flat over his mouth. He did not say a word. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Maggie Calloway returned to Sevierville the morning after the taping. Dolly called her every Sunday for the next 11 weeks. The photograph, Maggie's copy, was framed by her daughter and placed on the bedroom wall beside the window Maggie had looked out of every morning for 40 years. Dolly's copy now sits on a shelf in her recording studio in Nashville, between a Grammy and a photograph of her mother. Maggie died on a Wednesday morning in June. She was 74 years old. Her daughters wrote the obituary and mentioned only one public event by name. Dolly Parton attended the memorial service in Sevierville. She sat in the third row. She did not perform. She stayed until every other person in the room had gone. On the drive back to Nashville, she told her assistant she was going to finish a song she had started writing in 1967 and had never been able to find the right ending for. Some harmonies wait a long time to be heard again.